3. All right, Alex, is that good? Can you see? Yeah, it's broadcasting.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. All right, we're back up. Sorry about that. I appreciate the patience. Okay, so anyone know what this .map function does? Dan?
Function. The same function on every.
Run the same function on every index in an array. That's exactly right. Let's give them a round of applause. Can you tell me what it returns? Another array of transformed objects, right? Based off of what you return from the function. Yep, that's exactly what map does. And why would that be useful in this scenario? Anyone have an idea? No ideas? The reason why this is really useful is it's very easy to return a React component, right? So just a list item here. And what this returns is an array, like Dan said, of React components. And React is smart enough that if you have an array of React components, it can just take every React component out and build them sequentially. In this case, it's building all of the list items. And actually, if I go over to trusty Google and I open the React app, you can see it's rendering that way, right? It's not a super pretty app. No one said it would be. But it still renders in a list, just as we would expect from that map. So there's a few things to lists like this that are really important in React. Ben, you said you were reading about the key. Can you explain it? You think you know enough to explain what's there? So the key, basically when you have a list of sequential React objects, you need some sort of key to identify what these are. The key is really important for React to be able to render efficiently what's going on with these, especially if something changes. If there's a new key, a key is removed, what say you? React needs to know about this to be able to effectively, build it without wasting time. It's nice because this key, while you may be like, oh man, I need the key, what if I forget the key and then things don't render? They'll still render. You'll just get an error. And it'll be like, hey man, we need a key. You can see here, each child of the array or iterator should have a unique key prop. It'll tell you you need a key, but it'll still render fine. I mean, you'll still see it. The only difference is it might be a little less efficient. So you should always work on having a key. What is a key? Really anything that comes from a database, a unique identifier, it just has to be unique. You can't have the same key on 5 different items. It defeats the purpose of the key altogether. In this instance, we have an ID property that we're using. It's just a number. And there you go. It renders the key. One thing you cannot do with the key is use the index of the array you're iterating through. So like in map, you can get to the index that you're over right now. So first item would be 0, then 1, then 2. You can't use that as the key. React's smart enough to say, hey man, that's not cool. You can't use that as the key. And it'll say that to you. It'll say, please don't use, like warning, don't use the index as a key. So that's really all there is to a list of components. And we can use the prop. It's an array, right? That's what we passed it in. Anyone confused about how this array is rendered in at all? Nope. Cool. Really quickly, let's go ahead and look at the bonus list. What's up? Sure.
So I have the first part where it says using map method render when li element is running. Text property, but like
no, you just need to take these elements, right? It said to map them, you map them. And there's another prop on all of the items, right? So if we look back at the items, you have an ID, a name, and a purchased. And you can render that name, the name of the specific item that you're mapping over, into that React component and then return that React component. It sounds more difficult than it actually is. Like it sounds like a really difficult thing. Like, oh, how am I going to do that? And it is in the beginning. When you're still uncomfortable with React, like this is a hard thing to grasp, but you can just loop over an array and return a bunch of stuff and it happens to render, right? It's kind of weird. The definition of map, the .map function. Map is a general term for a type of function in any programming language. You'll hear it a lot in your career. Okay? And a map basically says it's taking in one array and it's running a function over everything in the array and returning some other array. So that function usually transforms the array from one to another.
So that.
It is a function.
Array, and it changes it?
Yeah. So you give map another function, and you tell it how to change the item, right? So you can see here on this example, we have a function that takes in an item, okay? And it's changing that item from just being an item to being this entire React component. And the array that we're mapping over is this groceries array, okay? So groceries.map, take every item, turn it into a React component, and that returns a whole nother array. The same number of indexes, right? The same number of indices, different looking elements now.
So we could turn so basically we're turning this array into a card. So we could use that for card finder, create another card.
If you had, you could have. Yeah, you could use .map that way. If you had a database that was returning friend information, right? And you just wanted to create a friend card for every friend you had in your records, you could totally use .map. That's a perfect example of how you'd want to use it. Yep. So mapping is a really kind of complicated sounding term in programming that is pretty useful. And once you see how it works, I don't think it's too bad. It just takes a little while to wrap your head around what's happening. It's totally transforming that array. Yes, Cody?
Is it best practice to pass the array down to the child?
Yeah, most of the time. Now, what you could see is you have this array that you're going to map, right? And then for every item, you actually pass props of that down to another component. If that other child component's really complex, like in this case, it's just an LI with a class name, a key, and then some text, right? But if this LI was something more complicated, like even a friend card, you might pass props of the item you're mapping over into the friend card and then render those and however you want, right? But yeah, it's best practice to render the children, right, where you'd have a whole component built to just render some stuff in a list form and map over them. That's good practice, yeah. All right, so let's look at the bonus really quick. This one is slightly different, and it uses another function to make it a little bit more complicated. Can anyone explain what filter does? Cleans it up how? You're on the right track. You're really close. Okay.
Oh, filter grocery purchase. Okay, so basically the filter is going to separate the not purchase from the purchase. But you have to set up a variable that the filter can be used for.
Right. So it's definitely going to separate the purchase from the not purchase. That's what it's doing.
It's like a definition template. What is filter?
No, you don't know that. What does this filter do?
This filter is separating purchase.
Right. So it's taking that groceries array, right, just like the map, and it's running a filter over them. So if not purchased, okay, and then it's returning what? It's returning the purchased or the not purchased? So the exclamation point here, in case you forgot, just says evaluate truthiness. So this is not true. If it is not purchased, that's what we're looking for. Is this grocery not purchased? If that's the case, what filter does is you get a function in, and that function looks for a Boolean return value, okay? So a true or false. And you return a true or a false. In this case, if it's not purchased, we're returning true, because we want to filter out the not purchased items only. And then it returns the second array of not purchased items. And that's it. That's all that's in this array. So it's slightly different. Whereas map keeps all of the original, it keeps the same number of indices. It just transforms them a bit. Filter doesn't transform them. It gets rid of the ones you don't want to be there. So you can imagine if I only want things that have a price of less than $10. You could take an array of all your groceries, right? And anything with a price greater than 10, you just forget it. Filter it out, right? You can get an array of just the things with a price under $10. And so filter, another very helpful function. Make sense?
Yeah, you can use like an if else thing.
You could do an if else, but the advantage of using the filter of the if else is if you have an array, you may not know how many elements are going to be in the array, right? And so you can just use the filter to run over all of the elements. Now, if you know how many elements you're going to have in your array, it might make sense to use an if else. Might still make sense to use a filter. But you can look at it like an if else. It's exactly what it is. If, this is not purchased, then I'm going to want it. If it is purchased, I'll just forget it.
So you remember that activity where you use like 26 letters in the alphabet, like Kangan?
Yeah.
Could you use the filter method for that? Maybe like make 600. One or two of them have 26 letters. You filter for 26 letters.
So you have all the words comprised of letters. Can you filter out based off of the letters you've used?
Yeah, so like, I guess I wrote 6 sentences. And 2 of them have all 26 letters.
I see. So return every letter, return any letter that wasn't found in the sentence. Yeah. So if you had 6 sentences, 2 of them use every letter in the alphabet, and you want to find out which ones don't use certain letters or which ones do use every letter, you can definitely use the filter. For instance, you have A through Z, filter over, hey, does A exist? Does B exist? Does C exist? Read it. And anyone that has any element that comes back, obviously it didn't use that letter, right? And that's the perfect way to do that. Yeah, it's a great way. The way you could use filter. So any more questions on how these mapping, filter, all that stuff works? Cody?
So you could also put a if statement inside of the map for each index of the array, and like said if not purchased, and then return like null.
You
know what I mean?
Yeah. So put an if else in the map, return null if it's purchased already. I'm gonna show it. Why don't we see what that looks like? Because returning null sometimes has different effects, right? So we'll go ahead and try to add some curly braces around this. Curly braces. Return. This is bad format. Use this format I'm using in here. If keyboard's really weird. It just I always hit the trackpad with my palm, and then it just like moves it to random places. So if the item is already purchased, we're going to just return null. Otherwise, we're going to return the item, right? That's what you're thinking?
Yeah.
You can, yeah. React takes care of the nulls itself. That's another way you could do it, totally. Now, drawbacks to doing that, you still have all the same number of elements in the array, just some of them happen to be null. And if you're using something that isn't looking for nulls, or you want that array to actually be the size it should be, the non-null elements, right? Then filters may be a better approach, depending on how you want to use it. But yeah, definitely, you can do that. Cool. All right, so any more questions on this before I close it? Before we move on? No? Cool. All righty, let's see what we got next. So, let me just open up this. The elements we talked about so far, they've all been what's called dumb components, functional components, right? All they've done is taken some props and do something with those props. But what if you have an element where you want to do something, you want to interact, and you want to maintain the data that's being changed, right? So say you have, like, for instance, a button, and you want to click the button, and every time you click the button, you want to keep a counter of how many times you click that button. You use something called a stateful component. And this is the second part of React that makes React awesome, okay? You get something called state. So in those props components that we've been using so far, would there be any way to do this? Can you think of any way to maintain how many times I've clicked this button and display it? Does anyone have any idea how we could do that? So I'm clicking a button, right? Every time I click this button, click count goes up by 1, right? We've been using functional components so far that just had props. Is there any way with the components we've used so far to be able to maintain this click count? Yeah. Kind of a trick question because the answer is no. So don't think too hard about it because it's no, and you could think a long time about, oh, how could I, trick the system to work? And you probably could come up with some clever solution. But realistically, that's not what we want at the end of the day. Let's open up some more code here. Let's take a look at stateful components. So we just saw how it would work. We have this counter, okay? Definitely a different form we have to talk about. A lot has changed. No longer do we have just this function that's being returned that takes in some props and does some stuff. Now we have a class. Now, are we all familiar with this class extends? Anyone have questions on how this works?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, I'll go over it. So we have a class. Classes are basically like an object, but they automatically build constructors for you. That's really what it is. And you can use this extends to implement stuff that's happened in whatever you're trying to extend. So for instance, React component is a class itself. And then by extending it with counter, you can add more functionality to it. Error is a really good example of this. We all done the throw new error and you pass in the string or whatever. You can do the same thing with error by class my error extends error. And then you'd still get the message and all that stuff that needs to be passed in. You just have like a wrapper almost around that the other class that you're trying to use. So when you want a stateful component, you need to extend this React.component that you import from React. And the reason why is we no longer want just the props to cause the component to re-render. We want the component to be able to re-render itself. And you can see, remember when I said earlier that when we just have a function, we call it the render function, even though it's an anonymous function. Now we actually have a function called render on this class. And it returns all of our JSX that we're familiar with, right? So this part, this render function, we should all be familiar with it at this point. It just returns some JSX, returns some HTML, whatever, and then it's going to render it out. But there's one difference. This bad boy right here. This dot state. Well, there's two differences. One, this. Second, dot state. Before, we didn't have that, right? We just had props. Now, can anyone give me a guess at what this is referencing?
This is reference
To the counter? Exactly. Referencing to the counter. And therefore, because it's extending the React component, it's also referencing the React component. Now, an example of what I mean by extending is almost like a wrapper around this React component is this.setState. Does anyone see anywhere in this file where I'm defining setState? I don't. I did not define that function. However, I can access it with this. And the reason why is React.component has a function on it called setState. This is the initial state. So this dot state, but there's a function state that we can call and that you call in React that changes the state and therefore changes what's rendered on the screen.
So with state already being declared, we just React has the components inside of that. So like anytime you create that, and you can do certain things with it.
Right. Anytime that state changes, you can change what's rendered in the React component. I could have it change completely. I could render a div with some divs and a p tag like this, and then when I click the button, I could have it render an unordered list. Like you can do whatever you want because again, it's the render function, and just like the props, if the props change, you can change how it renders. If the state changes, you can also change how it renders. And in this case, it's a pretty simple example of what state is. However, there's a lot going on here, and it's really important to understand all of the moving parts, right? So kind of weird that they have a few ways to define things in the class. First of all, anyone notice the difference between how we define properties in this class versus how we would do it in a regular object? Remember, in a regular object, you have curly braces. How do you set a property name equal to a value? Colon, right? Just like in this state right here, just like count. Colon. However, this has an equal sign, right? It's different. That's not the same as just your run-of-the-mill object. The class has different syntax. It does. And that kind of is a bummer because it's extra stuff to remember. But it's good stuff to remember because classes are very helpful. As we can see with these React components, we get all kinds of functionality baked into this class without us doing anything, just by extending the React.component class. And that's pretty awesome. So properties in a class, you're going to set them, have to be set with an equal sign. And you can see here, this is like our anonymous function, right? It still is equal to the function, has the, the braces has the go-to arrow right here that equals less than or equals greater than, whatever you want to say. This is the go-to arrow, goes to. And then here we have actually a function baked into the class. This is not an anonymous function. This function is render. If you were to create an instance of the counter class, right, we could do const counter equals new counter, right? You could call counter.render. You see, it's even showing up in my autocomplete. So that's a named function on there. Handle increment is 2, but it's not actually a function. It's a property that happens to be a function. And so is state. State's on there as well. And you see my autocomplete is picking this up. There's also other functions. Should component update. Component will mount. Component will receive props. These are all, as you can see, it says method, React component. These are all based off of that React component class that we're extending. Okay? So the classes, they're a bit new. They're a bit confusing, but once you understand them, they're super powerful. This is something called inheritance. So if you want to get more technical and look it up what it is, that's what it's called. Anyone have any questions on how this class works? On how we're setting things and what this means? That constructor look familiar, right? We've done stuff with constructors. You all remember constructors? And this is just a new way that we can define those constructors without having to build the function and then assign to prototypes and do all that old funky stuff that JavaScript used to require. ECMAScript 6, the stuff that you get in Node, and when you're using React, using Babel, has these cool classes, makes it way easier. And I think Chrome actually has it built in now. So let's get into the meat of what's actually happening here. Now that we know that there's a class, we're extending from the class. There's functions like setState built into the class. We can take advantage of that. So let's go from top to bottom. Anyone want to gander at what this does? I know it may seem stupid, but what does that do? Yeah, what else? Highlight. It counts at 0, right? What is it? What is it setting on the class? Yeah.
So every time that you count in state and count plus 1.
We will be doing that, yeah, when we increment the count. But what is it setting right away when the class is created? 0, and it's setting the state, right? So the state is an object, the count equal to 0. First things first, we're setting up the initial state of the counter, right? Is a counter component, just as this says right there. Handle increment. Cool. So this is a sweet function that we can call to increment the state count, right? So set state here takes in a new object. You can see this new object has the same properties, count, as the default state that we set, except for I'm taking this dot state, so the state at that moment, count, which would be 0 the first time I click it, and then adding 1. So after this function runs, what is count going to equal? 1 plus 1, 1, right? If I run it again, it's going to equal 2. And when I was clicking the button, that's what it did, right? It was pretty easy to tell. It was a rocket science. I clicked it, it went up one. That's what it's doing. This is the code right there that changes that function, where we're returning the JSX, we're returning that HTML. It's going to be rendered. We have two things. We have the current count value, and we also have this fun on click dot handle increment. So it's calling this function right here, handle increment, setting the state count equal to the current state count. It says increment. This is all just your standard HTML right here. I'm going to run it again, but is this all making sense? I know there's a lot here, but it's important to learn this. So if you have questions, feel free to ask. And we'll go ahead and look at it again. Refresh it. Start at 0. So let's. I'm going to open this here. I'm going to try to open up this. Come on. Here. And we'll just kind of walk through what might be happening. All right. Our current count is 0, right? The page loads. We have this counter component. It sets state count equal to 0. It builds this handle increment function, and it returns a div with class panel, all this fun stuff, and a button. This is increment. Count is 0. We click it. Boom. Calls this handle increment function that's on the button. See, on click handle increment. Calls this. We can even console log from here if you want. Oops. Okay, this keyboard is terrible. Console log this state count, right? Just to be certain. Actually, why don't we just console log the whole state out? Just to be certain there's not anything else funky going on. Go ahead and do this. Let's reload it. Click. Oh my gosh, nothing console. Okay, well, it's not going to console log for me, apparently. No, never mind. Sure. The state count to -1? Oh, I see. Right there?
Yep.
Anyone have any ideas what will happen? It's going to go down. Did it go down?
It's still gonna go. Okay.
Now I'm wondering if I'm even looking at the right files. Yeah. So it would go down if that's what we're looking at. However, it's not because these are the wrong files. So it's a good thing to remember. Oh, yeah. You know why? I know why. Hold on. Let me grab the real file so I can show you this better. Let's see. This is in the count. Okay. Boom. Open this bad boy up. We'll go into our source. This should work. That's what they say. Log this state, right? Nothing cool, crazy going on there. Now let's run this again. Hey, look at that. Oh, we did it. Nice.
So what exactly was missing in that previous? Like, why couldn't you do it the first time?
Because those are the wrong files.
What was missing?
What do you mean? I was editing random code. I don't even know where that code was.
Okay.
I was just changing code out in the ether somewhere. I was like, hey, look, it'll work. And it didn't. I was like, oh, okay. So anyway, now we can see it's rendering, it's console logging the state here right before we call set state, and then it's changing it. And you can see it renders it as -4, but then the click count shows -5 because every time the state changes, it tells the React component to re-render. Just like if the props change, state changes, we're going to re-render. Okay? So that's the basics of what state is. Does anyone have any questions on that? Because that's us. It's pretty important, and we're just going to go into one more activity before we break on state. If you got any more questions, get them out. Tim?
What would be like the best way to just look at stuff like that, just to, get it in your head?
What do you mean by look at stuff? Like walk through it?
Yeah. Like, what would you Google if you wanted to?
What would you Google? That's a really good question. If I want to learn more about state. For instance, how to properly set state. One thing I always do when I'm Googling something related to code is I always end it with what I'm like the library or the framework I'm using. So I would do React.js, right? Understanding, oh, look at that, set state. This is some article by some guy. Could be good, could be bad. This is one of the fun things with the internet. This guy could tell you some stuff that's great and then just be a total idiot on everything else he says. You won't know until you're further along in your career, but still, I'm sure there's plenty in here about how set state works. And it's another great example. Look, he's doing what I'm doing. Console log the value out, see how the state changes, blah, blah, blah. So when searching for terms and how you want to do it, try to search for what exactly you want to do and then the library you're trying to do it with. So how to, let's see, use a will component mount or component will mount React.js. It'll fix it, right? Pre-mounting with component will mount, right? So we got to figure that out someday in the future. Here's a perfect example of how to use it. And it even corrected me because it's component will mount, not will component mount. So perfect. Does set kind of help you a little bit in how you look at it? So that's how I search when I'm searching. I Google a lot of things because I certainly don't know everything, and I'm told to do everything. So, you kind of got to figure it out. So knowing how to search is definitely a great skill to have. Okay. Any other questions about state, how this works, how this renders? Like, look, if we look at the app.js, we just have this counter object, right? Or the counter React component. Nothing fancy there. Everything fancy happens in here. This is the exact syntax you need to use. Class, your new class's name, extends React.component. If you don't have that, React won't know what to do. Trent?
Because we don't know what you can do. And classes all differently.
Uh-huh.
You build up that class and try to follow that function. Other maybe
So if I wanted to create the counter myself and call a function on it, what would it look like?
what I'm saying is like the difference on the function that is inside of the class if you push to it versus
I see what you're saying. So inside of the class, we can't just call the handle increment, right?
yeah.
Right, because it's a property on the class, okay, you need to reference it with this, just like any other object. Now, if I was trying to just, if I took this out, now I could do this, but there's going to be a problem. I take it out, right? Move it up here. I don't need this handle increment anymore. Is this going to work? But doesn't know about this. So I could still call handle increment this way, like I am right here, but you can't bind it to anything. So it's kind of useless in that sense, especially if you need to access this. And with React components, you often do. But that's the difference. Yeah, if it's a property on the component or on the class, you need to use this to reference it. Okay. Alex, you want to select out the next activity? We'll do that. We're going to work on that for a little bit. Then we'll take a break. Then we have a couple more things to go over before we go home.
Every time the state changes, it automatically does render.
Yes. Every time the state changes, just does it again. But that's a caveat, right? You don't do anything other than change the state. However, if you change the state in an inappropriate time, like in the render function,
Right.
it'll render forever, right? Because it's just going to say, oh, it changed the state, re-render it again. Oh, but the render function changes the state, so re-render it again. But it changes state, so re-render, and then you render forever, and your app is frozen. And you're like, oh my gosh, So there's a caveat to it automatically re-rendering, and that is you have to be careful about where you set state, where you change props, stuff like that. You got to be very mindful of it. So the next activity should be out there. Looks like he's got the link to GitLab again, right? because there's probably some links in the README. So go ahead, check those out, work on that for a little bit. You can do this as partners, so you can collaborate. I know we've been kind of working alone so far today, but feel free to talk to everyone around you. Kind of figured out the state stuff is even more confusing than what we saw before. So take your time, try to think about it. This is not, it's decrement counter. We have 2 more after this. Random factor, I don't know if we do that one. Yeah, friend refactor's next after the break, and then we're going to demonstrate forms real quick. So we're not going to get a long break today. Sorry, guys. I know we've gone for a while, so if you want to take your break now and go to the bathroom or whatever, go ahead, and we'll just we'll talk about this at like 8:45-ish, 8:50-ish. So feel free to use this time to do whatever, but it's a good activity to work on. So. Yeah, I'm probably gonna just do 5 minutes. Just really quick look at it. Like I can't show you. I don't have time to read. The next one's critical.
20 minutes, yeah. 20 minutes. We'll go over that one.
One other statement.
Oh, it's important.
Yeah, I feel like it's more important than I said.
Yeah, yeah.
They need it.
It's late. It's very. I mean, it's the whole reason. You guys want to explain what grow? You can say, after office hours, and you can go into more detail with these topics as reference and stuff.
what you do.
Like, one, parents' house, both parents home, dad, and then my parents' house and my grandma's house.
Really nice one, but I don't like most people buy.
Well,
That's it.
highest stuff in math.
I like that.
No, the math is gonna have it.
Dude, mashed potatoes and gravy, and my wife made sweet mashed potatoes, mashed yams, really. Yeah, and those are
Let's put pecans and brown sugar on them.
pecans. You don't put pecans on those. You put brown sugar.
Brown sugar.
Pecans go off pecan pie.
Marshmallows?
Marshmallows, we didn't, but like that's cool. I'm cool with it. She's not. She hates marshmallows because she's kind of weird. So she's like, I'm not gonna put them on.
How did
So,
you feel about s'mores?
generally like, yeah, she's weird. Yeah, she's
Maybe the texture.
Yeah, you know, especially when you cook them, they get really like sticky. Yeah. Alex is a man for sweets. You give him some candy or something, he goes to town. Did you see that dude wreck a Pazuki?
These are,
Life,
I owe him a couple.
I love like,
life changes.
I don't like or
Which is
like
weird.
the sweet, like fruity, like you know that kind of candy. Like
Chocolate, dude.
Yeah, like,
Reese's, man.
yeah,
I can eat Reese's all day until I die.
Have you ever frozen?
Yeah, that's awesome. If I didn't have some like rational side to me, I would probably be diabetic because I would just eat Reese's all day. But you know, I have a wife, and then I'm like, I feel bad getting all fat, so can't do that.
I like your teaching style. Those are pretty lucky.
You like my teaching style?
Yeah, you remind me of this visual basic professor I had. He was.
That's
like,
not good.
No, that's a good thing. He was like so technical, and he was like really good at explaining the technical. He had a PhD in mathematics.
Nice.
He was fucking math, like nerdiest person I've ever met in my life. Really I explained the technical things and not deviating into like weird topics that make sense. You did a good job. I like it.
That's good. Hopefully they feel the same way. This is important stuff. So, do you want to do anything on Wednesday?
Yeah.
All
Yeah,
of
they
them.
look like they have a night filter on them.
Yeah. That's just sweet.
Oh, all the screens being red? Yeah, I have flux. So it's a red hue over it at night.
For your eyes.
Yeah, I don't think it actually works, but I've turned it on. I've just never turned it on. So
Mine automatically turns on at 9 o'clock.
yeah,
Yeah.
Green light.
mine's like slow dim over to the course of the day.
Oh, that's from your.
So what I've read, definitely like brighter and more jarring. Without, but what I've read is these like flux and luminous and stuff. They don't actually do like a full red shift. It's blue with red on top. So you're not actually getting the benefit of like full, you know, not looking at blue light, not staying awake. What you need is something that actually changes the way the monitor displays the pixels to be red. On phones, you can't do that. I could do this on here, but I just haven't.
So that Apple might.
Probably not.
No,
It's,
that one is true because that one came from Apple.
if it came from Apple, it might be okay.
Yeah, right. They can change their phone however they want. So that one is.
Why would I do that?
If Apple made it, it makes sense. And like on iBook, that one is good.
No question.
No question asked. Come on, man. You know better. The same you sleep.
Hey, Alex, when we start again, can you just make sure that the stream's still up?
Yeah, I check it out.
And it stops if I'm on too long. I think if it loses connection or something. So if the streamers are listening, they can chime in if they can hear me. I'm just talking next to the mic so they can hear this whole conversation. All that s'mores. Minutes, we're going to go over this homework. So if you haven't gotten it done, that's okay. You just need to go over it really quick because we have a couple more really important topics to talk about before we leave. And I don't want to leave you guys without those.
Oh, if anyone wants to buy like any like you did, they're on sale right now. They're like $10.
I bought a bunch of them yesterday.
Okay, cool. If you guys find any good ones, make sure you share with the class. Because those are hit or miss. Good people.
And I bought that React one from that guy that you like.
Andrew B, yeah, he's pretty
Yeah.
cool. I like him a lot. His note course is pretty good. If you guys need a refresher on
I got his new course too, actually.
that. And Mark Price, those are my two favorites. The Mark Price is mobile.
Probably, yeah.
Who?
My German guy, Max.
Oh yeah, he's good if you like Angular. He's an Angular guy.
I'm taking React.
He's not that good at React. I'd say it's Angular.
Bummer.
Yeah, I saw his React stuff, but I returned it. It's not that good. It's not good.
Why didn't that even React stuff?
It's not as good.
Because Alex is a React expert. And so every time someone says something about React, he's like, that's dumb. You're stupid.
That's someone else that Andrew, yeah.
Reviews, 5 star.
That's because he's really good at Angular. And he was
Not done mine, though. I have one on assembly and one on Go. I have not even. I've just been so busy doing other things. I'm not going to get too course on assembly. Pretty much. Yeah, like cooking and all kinds of weird stuff.
Photoshop and anything you can think of. Well, not anything, but anything technical.
So I downloaded one. I told you about that. The Linux kernel development one.
Okay.
That was the worst thing ever. I immediately was like, refund me all my money. I bought 2 of these courses in there. Okay, great. But I was like, hey, I want to learn about Linux kernel development. And the course was basically like, an OS it was this really heavy accent, like Russian guy. And so he used poor English. He's like, OS is softwares that user uses to computer. And you're like, what? What is going on? It was really weird.
That's funny.
I had a teacher in college that taught MATLAB.
Yeah.
That was her first course. She was in China. And she would just spend about 15 minutes writing a bunch of code and on the marker board, and then she would turn it to class and say, how to do it. That would be it.
Nice. Let's do it.
She was very nice though. So I'd fall asleep and she'd be like, you going to make it to class? I said, well, that's apparently the next time.
I don't know how to do. Yeah, everyone. Laura? Yeah, I'll give her like another minute and then I'll just go. It's not terrible. She misses the explanation of this. You want to get ready to get the next assignment stuck out? Perfect timing. Oh, Kimura just stepped out though. All right. Well, we're gonna go over this this last assignment we just did really quick, like 5 minutes. Can't demo it because we got to move on. But we'll cover it if you have any quick questions. Like we'll obviously dive into any questions you got. Okay, so let me try to drag this over. Well, we're getting there. So there was two, a basic and a bonus. Now, Jesse helped you out a little bit because he asked about how do we decrement the state? What happens if we use a -1, right? Kind of what this was about. So did anyone finish? Trent, you finished? Bethany, you finished? Dan? Nice, awesome. Anyone finish the bonus? Bonus? No, bonus was a lot harder. But the basic one was basically you've got this increment, right? You hit the increment button and it goes up. Add a way to decrement. In which case, we'll do pretty much what I did in the example and just do a -1 from the state. And you can hit the increment, add 1, decrement, subtract 1, get it back to 0, do whatever you want to do. Any questions on how any of this works? Nope. Cool. So the bonus one is a little bit more intense, right? They wanted you to separate that stuff out into another component and pass stuff down through the props. A little bit more advanced, right? And this is kind of how you're going to see your React components being built in a real app. If you do stuff for homework or whatever, it's going to be more like this. And this is how you're going to want to do it. So we have the same concept with the increment and the decrement. That's all there. But now we have, here, I'll increase the size on this. We have this panel body component that we're going to use. We're going to pass in the current count. We're going to pass in the handle increment function, and we're going to pass in the handle decrement function. And those are going to be props. And then in here, we have a simple render function, right? It's just a function. Takes in some props. The click count equal to the props.count. The on-click of the increment is just the handle increment prop. The on-click of the decrement is just the handle decrement prop. Those are those functions, right? They map directly to them. And again, you get the same functionality. Plus, minus, increases the count, decreases the count. Anyone have any questions on this one? This is a little bit more complicated. Darnell?
So on the activity, it says that panel body create a new component.
Yes.
So the component doesn't need to have that class.
You don't need the class unless you want state, right? And the panel body does not need its own state. It just uses props. The counter component is the one that has the state. It has the count, right? And this is a good example of the parent passing state down as props through the children. So again, we just have the function as the panel body. The state's all held in here. React.component has the state, okay? And then it's got a child, panel body. It's just a function that takes in some props. Again, when you're building a tree of components in React, it's really good to have the topmost parent have state and nothing else. And have the rest just be props all the way down to the very last child. That's going to save you a ton of headache. And even if it means like this count, you're like, hey, this count's being rendered here in this panel body, right? Well, wouldn't I want to just keep the count as a state here and just affect it here? Like, yeah, okay, you could do that. But what that means is you'll be rendering the panel body, and then you'll be rendering the counter as well as the parent, and the counter won't hold any state, but the child will, and then it just gets kind of weird. And if you want to make changes to the state, like say you want to do a multiply button, well, where do you add it? Well, if you want to add it here, where do you want to control the state? So remember, it's a good idea to have your state controlled by the topmost parent in a tree. I know that might not make so much sense now, but as you're building out apps, you'll see it a little bit more of what I mean. And it'll take some fine-tuning to figure out where to put the state, but you'll get there. Any more questions on this model? What's up, Darnell?
Could you place that panel body function within the class? So,
Could you repeat that for me?
could you place
Put the panel body function inside of the class.
Yeah.
Okay, so Darnell's question was, could you have this panel body function inside of this other React class? No, you can't. You can only have one render function. I mean, technically you could return JSX from any function. You can, but that kind of defeats the purpose. So this right here, what they have with the separate panel body is more React-like, right? Where you have separate components, the children take just props, and the parent has state. Because technically, if we were to have another function on here that just returned the HTML and you rendered it from inside this class, it would still be part of that class. And you're not really getting any benefit of separating them at that point. So remember, the benefit of separating is if I need another panel body that happens to have a handle increment and handle decrement function on it, then great, I can use it wherever. I just need to have these 3 props: count, handle, increment, handle, decrement. This is a very specific example, so it doesn't seem so intuitive that you'd want to reuse this panel body itself. But you'll see as you work a little bit more that they'll become more generic as time goes on, and then you will want to reuse them. Or maybe you will need to have a reason to reuse this panel body. I don't know, maybe you're building a counter app, right? So just try to think about that when you're building your components out. How much of this needs to be extracted to either make it a simpler component graph in the parent, or stuff needs to be reused. What say you? It's kind of hard to make this distinction, but experience lends itself well to that. Anything else before we move on? Cool. So Alex has another assignment he's going to Slack out, a friend refactor. We're going to give you about 20 minutes on this one, then go over it. This one's going to be a real tough one. Go ahead and work with partners if you want. Just try to work it out and get it done. Again, this one's on GitLab because there's going to be some links you're going to need. So Can you hear me, Jason? Yeah, no one's been talking, so. Well, now I'm talking. That's why you can hear me. Okay, we're gonna go over this one real quick, and then we'll have one more thing we're gonna look at, and then we'll all go home and have a great time. So this one was pretty tough. Did anyone finish it? No, it was hard. So I don't. You got close? Oh, the basic one? That's still awesome. Like, this is a hard one for sure. So let's look at it really quick, what the finished product looks like. You have the sweet friends list, and they're all rendered, and you can just delete them. Now you can imagine the way we did it the first time. We had the 3 different friends cards, one after another. And that would be really difficult if you have a bunch of friends like this person does, right? A ton of friends. This might be Tim, Tim has a ton of friends. So the goal of this exercise was to not only use state a little bit, but figure out a more efficient way for rendering all your friends. So let's go ahead and look at the code. Moving on over. If it'll maximize. Cool. All right. So the index.js, probably not going to look too unfamiliar to any of y'all. The app.js, though, there's a lot of changes in here. Is that too small? A little bigger? I'll make it a little bigger. So the app.js in here, now we're using this fun component syntax that we saw earlier. And you can see it's a little different, right? So they're actually just taking the component out of the React. So Nikki, when you were asking earlier about default and non-default, this is an example of having both. The default is the React. The non-default is taking out the component specifically. So that's how you take out both. React exports a bunch of stuff. So a couple of things to go over. This is the same class syntax, extending the class component like we talked about, right? Setting the default state equal to friends, and the friends is just all the friends from your friends.json file. And right here, is anyone not familiar with what this is doing? So this is kind of a fun syntax that I like to use. It's just friends inside of the state object. Anyone know what that does?
Kind of like it would be.
So it's like that, yeah, we're setting the initial state, but notice that this one doesn't have a colon. It's not friends, colon, friends.
Right. It's friend.
Why is that?
Put it that way.
We put it that way. Right, so if you have a variable that has the same name as the property you want in an object, you can actually use shorthand syntax and just put it in there as that variable. Instead of doing friends, colon, friends, which would be the same, you can just put friends, and it's the same as writing friends, colon, friends. So again, equivalent. Oops, that's not equivalent. Right, same thing. Anyway, shorthand syntax, in case you weren't familiar. So we have a remove friend, right? Because we need to remove the friend. And that's just going to run a filter on the friends that don't have the ID that you just selected. Okay? So there's a key, the ID on all of the friends cards. And when we call remove friend, it's going to pass that ID into this function, and we're going to find that friend and remove that friend using the filter. So this is similar to what Jesse was saying with the sentences. We'll find the friend that has that ID. Any friend that doesn't have that ID will be returned in a new array, and we'll re-render the friends without the other friend that we chose to remove. One thing about set state that I didn't quite mention before when we talked about it, a little bit more in depth on this. So does anyone have any idea why we would call a function set state instead of just changing the state directly? Kind of a tough question. And unless...
So it's kind of like return back to the previous reference too. If it was just that's a because it's wait, can you go up real quick?
Sure.
So we already have state equal.
Yeah.
Right. But we don't have the set state.
Well, why aren't we just doing this.state.friends equals the new friends? Why are we doing this set state and passing in a new state with friend?
Do we have more than one friend?
We do more than one friend.
More than one variable.
There's a very specific React reason of why we do this, which frankly you wouldn't know unless you read the docs, right? So it's kind of a hard question, kind of a tricky question to ask. But the set state, we use that because if we were to just call this.state.friends and mutate that directly, remember how earlier we used that word immutable about the props? State is the same thing. You don't technically want the state to change itself, but you need the state to change, right? It's kind of a weird way to talk about that, but the idea is if you change this state directly, React has no way to know that you did that. However, if you call a set state, you can pass the new state in. React can say, oh, okay, they gave me a new state. I can re-render this component, and then I'll change the state myself. It can also do a bunch of other things, right? So it's kind of a misnomer to say when I call this.set state that this.state immediately reflects that. If I were to call this.state.friends right under here, right, it would actually probably be the same as it was before I called set state. The reason why is even though this tells the React component to render right away, it doesn't necessarily. React determines based off of whatever's going on in the components at that time when it needs to re-render that. So there could be 5 other components that are re-rendering first, and then it'll re-render that one. It's kind of a batch render thing, but basically we use this.set state to say React, as soon as you can re-render this component, I need the state to change. So that's why we use set state. You don't want to set the state directly. You don't want to do this.state.friends equals whatever, or this.state.friends.splice, or something like that. That's not the way to do it. It'll really mess up React. All right, so we have this wrapper that goes around everything. And then we have a title, friends list, right? And then we're going back to that fun map. So this.state.friends, so we loaded that up in the initial state. We're going to map over the friend, and we're going to inject it into a friend card. All of those same properties, right? We have location, occupation, image, name. ID is the key. Remember that key property? Remember that one? We need a key because we have a list of similar components. React needs to know how to render them. ID, we have the ID passed in from the friend just because we're going to need it, obviously, in this remove friend function, right? Needs the ID. And then we have our remove friend function. It's a little bit more complex than it was before. Definitely requires a lot more thought and a little bit more planning to really make a nice reusable component. So again, this component nice and simple. It's very similar to how it was before, where it just takes some props and returns effectively a div with an image, some information about that image, and now it has a little X. You can see it's just an X. It renders as that red X that we saw at the top. Ooh, right here. And it actually calls props.removeFriend in the onClick. So you can see here it's got this empty parentheses, goes to props.removeFriend. That says execute a function that will then call props.removeFriend, and we're immediately passing in that ID, the props.id that we set up here, right? Boom, calls that. That then invokes this function, the remove friend. Calls the filter, set state, and we're back at it. Re-render all the stuff. We're good to go. All right? Does that make sense? Anyone have any questions on it? It's a really tough one for sure. Let's see. I think was there a bonus on that one too? Let's look and see how different, if there was a bonus. No, there was not. All right, so if no one has any questions on state, we're going to look at one other thing in React before we call it a day. Yes, will you cite out the solution for the student refactor, the friend refactor? Okay, so let me just run this app. We're going to talk about forms. So we all are familiar with forms at this point, right? Everyone knows what a form is? So we have this cool form. It's really simple, but it does a lot. It's got a first name, Carson. Last name, Howard. You can see it's just changing it on the screen right as I type. That's some React magic right there. Hit submit, says, hey, Carson Howard. Okay, resets it. Pretty simple. But forms, they require one state. And so there's something that's definitely important to look at. Yeah, I'm going to close this up. Okay. Go ahead, look at the index. Again, index, pretty straightforward, so it's never going to change. Right? This one is just going to go ahead and render our form component. Down here in our form, there's a lot of state going on here. This is going to be a complex class for sure. Now, if this is too small, can you all see it, or is that good? Yeah. There's a lot going on. It's more complex state for sure, but it still boils down to effectively the same thing that we've just seen a couple of times now. So if you're comfortable with state, this is probably not going to be a huge deal. If you're uncomfortable with state, this is a lot harder. We're kind of amping it up a bit. There's a bunch that we have to look at. So first thing you'll notice is we have our default state, right? First name and last name. Makes sense. Any questions on that? Right? Default state. Then we have two functions, handle input change and handle form submit. So the first one, handle form submit. Are we all familiar with, if you click submit on a form in HTML, it calls a JavaScript function, right? You can have it called JavaScript. That's what that's going to boil down to. And we'll go over the specifics of it. And some of this might look familiar already, event.prevent default and all that. And then there's handle input change. In our input type HTML elements, there's on change, right? Or on blur or something like that. This one happens to be on change. So if you have a text input, for instance, you can do something every time that text input changes. In this case, we're going to be updating state. And before we go to those functions, here's our render function. Not too different from the rest that we've seen so far. And you can see that it's rendering the state first name, the state last name. We have a nice form that we're all used to at this point, right? I have a couple of inputs, first name and a last name. The first name's value. You can see the input value. You can just, in React, set it directly equal to something in the state using your curly braces. Give it a name like you do most form elements. Here's our onChange handler. Calls the onInput change. And you can see both of these inputs are using the same function, so that function is definitely reusable. We have the type, text, and then a placeholder for them. Like, are any of these attributes Now, everyone comfortable with these, right? And they're pretty standard form attributes. And at this point, we've seen them a bit. And then lastly, we have our submit button. Submit, handle form submit on click. Anything about this render anyone wants to know before we look at the functions? So again, we're following that same paradigm. We have a stateful component. It's just going to render different values based off of the state we currently have in the component. And you can render them directly into the inputs, no problem. Nice and easy. So handle input change. This one's kind of cool. See, it has this event that comes in. Event, just like in all of the on-change handlers in jQuery or in JavaScript, the vanilla JavaScript, it's that same event, that E that comes in. You can call E.preventDefault and E.target and all that. It's the exact same thing. It has not changed just because it's React. You get that same event. If you need to get the value out, you can do the event.target. Now, everyone familiar with this destructuring syntax? Anyone need a reminder, refresher? Darnell, what's up?
Yes.
You need a refresher?
Yeah.
Cool. So, destructuring. Does anyone want to explain this? No? Don't want to give a crack? Okay. Well, we'll explain it. So, you'll notice it looks like an object, right? With these object curly braces around it, and then name and value. So name and value are the names of the properties that we're pulling out of event.target. Okay? So this would be the same as saying const name equals event.target.name, and const value equals event.target.value. Same thing, except for we made it look a lot simpler because we're just calling it in one place and destructuring it. The term is destructuring because you're taking an object and breaking it apart, right? Take everything from here, right? So the target might have another property, maybe as a property type, right, on the target. But I don't want to use it. I don't need to. It doesn't matter. You can take whatever you want out of there. But that's effectively the same thing as this. Destructuring is really powerful. You can actually use it even in function declarations. So I have event here. I could actually call it like target and prevent default. And then I could just call prevent default like that. And it's the same thing as calling event.prevent default. So destructuring is really powerful. You'll see it a lot in more advanced code, and as you start working on this professionally, you'll definitely see a lot of destructuring. So I would get used to using that syntax and seeing it because it's going to be around for a while. Cool. So we pulled the name out of the target, right? What is the name going to be? Any ideas? Whatever the name of the input is. Exactly, Cooey. Nice. And the value? Whatever's in the value of the input. Exactly. And then right here, set in the state, right? We're familiar with what set state does. Does anyone know what this syntax is? These brackets around name. Anyone want to take a guess? This is like a nice way to inject a variable name into an object. So say our state has first name, last name, right? So we have an input first name. First name changes. Name is going to equal first name, right? And we somehow want to change the first name property on an object. How do we do that? Well, one way is you could do first name equals something, right? Or if you happen to have first name stored in a variable, you could do that. And that says take the value of the variable and inject it as a property name on the object. It's like a pathing mechanism that JavaScript has. This is a super cool thing that, so far as I can tell, only JavaScript has, and you should really learn to take advantage of it because it can make for some dynamic and really powerful code. Any questions on that? This is the path. You're setting the path of the property. There's how to search for it. I would say how to dynamically look for JavaScript properties or something like that, right? You have to be creative in that one because it doesn't really have a name as far as I know. It might. I don't know. So, any questions on handle input change? All right, let's move to handle form submit. All right, handle form submit. Anyone want to take a crack at explaining this function? No one? Okay, let's go through it together then. Prevent default. What is that going to do? Prevents the page from refreshing. That's kind of important in a single page application, right? We're literally building this app to prevent refreshes. So if we refresh, what was the point? There's literally none. So that's something to definitely remember in React. Without it, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the point is. Alert. We all know what alert does, right? That's just your basic JavaScript alert. You could use prompts. You could use a confirm, whatever. Doesn't matter. And then we're just using that. Remember this? The tick marks. Anyone? It's going to display the first and the last name in that string. That is exactly correct. Awesome. Then lastly, we're setting the state equal to what? To default values, right? This is just the default value for set state. That's all it does. Nothing crazy there, right? Make sense? Any questions? Cool. So we had, we went over a lot today. And there's some stuff that we didn't get to. There's one more activity that Alex can Slack out for you, and you're more than welcome to look at it if you want to. Try to solve it on your own. If anyone has any questions about any of this, obviously we'll be here office hours. Hopefully I didn't do a bad job and you guys learned some stuff today. Yeah, that's class. So go nuts. You're welcome. Thank you.
There is a homework assignment after the React portion of it. You guys are not required to do it. That is for like the next cohort. You just get added literally a couple weeks ago. But I pushed it up if you guys want to look at it. Everything else is in GitLab. All the solutions, and then the last assignment Carson was talking about. Those were the very last ones, like 16. And yeah.
Thank you. Cool. Well, that's that. That's React. Everyone feeling okay about React at this point? I know it's, yeah, it's a lot for sure. All right, I'm killing the stream.